When Nerva was made emperor in AD 96 by the Roman Senate, members of Rome's nobility had hoped that a new constitutional norm would be established. It wasn't a return to the Republic, but at least the Senate had more say than they had ever had in the selection of the emperor. But as we saw in the last episode, the harsh realities of the Pax Romana reasserted themselves. A group of soldiers stormed the imperial palace until their demands were met, including the adoption of a new emperor, Trajan. Members of the Senate now had to face facts. The Republic was gone, and elements of the military were equally, if not more important than them. To us, this sounds like the kind of junta or military dictatorship that rarely lasts long, but in fact, with the accession of Trajan, the Roman Empire would enter its most dominant and prosperous period. It would also be an era free from major civil wars or usurpations. But how did the new emperor Trajan manage to get this most remarkable phase of the Pax Romana off on the right foot? Find out on this episode of the Pax Romana podcast. Episode 29, Enter Trajan. Before we begin, I'd like to let you know my book, Pax Romana, The Plague That Shook the Roman World, is now available for ordering. It is out. It's good to go. Go check it out on Amazon or anywhere books are sold. I hope you enjoy it. Let's get on with the show. If you've been following the podcast, back in episode 23, when Nero died, a power vacuum opened, into which appeared numerous claimants for the empire. And when Nerva died, Trajan was outside Rome. In theory, an ambitious senator or military leader could have attempted to take the city, but he didn't. The fact that no Roman felt he could usurp Trajan speaks volumes about the state of political power in Rome. The spirit of civil war had finally dissipated. War weariness had set in. Trajan would have every opportunity to rule without an immediate threat against his position. So perhaps for this reason, or perhaps just to set a tone for the new regime, when Trajan finally entered Rome in AD 98, he did so not in the dress of a conqueror or a general. He didn't wear military gear or armor, but he wore the civilian toga of a princeps, a first among equals. The new emperor celebrated games to show his beneficence to the people. He also ordered the previous emperor, Nerva, deified. Now, this measure suggests continuity with the previous regime, as though Nerva hadn't been kidnapped until he adopted Trajan by force. But the divinization of Nerva, who was technically Trajan's legal father through the adoption, well, this did for Trajan what Julius Caesar's divination did for Rome's first emperor, Augustus. It made Trajan the son of a god, a crucial mark of legitimacy for any Roman emperor. And interestingly, Trajan was the first emperor not born in Italy. And while by this time there was increasingly less distinction between well-established provincial elites with citizenship and Romans, perhaps some of Trajan's propaganda during his reign was aimed at reassuring a watching world that he was a true Roman, despite his provincial birth. And Trajan had plenty of help in these efforts. Most in the Senate were prepared to rally around him, in part because the new emperor decided to execute the Praetorian prefect who led the kidnapping of the previous emperor Nerva. This prefect, as you might remember from just the last episode, was an ally of the hated emperor Domitian. But by executing this prefect, Trajan showed that he was willing to enact justice. At the same time, he permitted no other extrajudicial killings, nor did he really go after anybody else. One of his main allies in the Senate was Pliny the Younger, the nephew of Pliny the Elder, who died in the eruption of Vesuvius. We talked about that also on a previous episode. Well, Pliny the Younger was made consul very early in Trajan's reign, and in response, he wrote a fawning, flattering speech called the Panegyricus Trajano, or in English, In Praise of Trajan. This speech, which survives to this day, uses Trajan as an example of not just a good emperor, but a great emperor. And this is in stark contrast to Domitian, who was a bad emperor. So in one section of the panegyric, Pliny even very plainly says that Trajan isn't a god, he's a man. Quote, "Let us not address Trajan with the flattering title of a god or divinity, for we speak not of a tyrant, but of a fellow citizen, not of a master, but of a father. He boasts that he is one of us, nor does he forget that he is only a man, though the ruler of men." That's Pliny in his Panegyricus. So Pliny's not saying here that there's nothing special about the new emperor, far from it. Trajan could claim to be a divinity, but by not doing so in the way that Domitian or Caligula had done, Trajan was showing that he had the right to rule, that he was a moderate and judicious emperor who understood his role. And from Pliny, there's a kind of acceptance here as well, that the Roman emperor is not merely just a guardian of the republic either. He's something more than that. He's its father, and in many ways, its ruler. Senators and citizens may not be slaves, they may not call the emperor master, but they're still subordinates, and they know their place. And accepting this new status quo is portrayed by Pliny as really the only reasonable course forward. Trajan came into the role of emperor as an experienced military officer and commander. We don't know much about the details of his military career, but it seems that at least some of it was spent along the borders of the Danube River. This river, which is an important boundary, runs through Central Europe. It forms much of the southern border of what is now modern Romania. And the Romans had quite a lot of difficulty policing this river, and large groups of Germanic migrants often made their way into Roman territory by crossing over the Danube. One of the great kings from across this river was Decebalus of the Dacians. Roman authors like Cassius Dio describe him as a clever and strategic thinker, a king with the wits to entrench himself and pester the Roman army for decades. Decebalus was so good, in fact, that he had defeated 2 Roman legions in a battle that took place near the end of Domitian's reign. The defeat was obviously an embarrassment for Domitian, but it got even worse because other Germanic tribes launched invasions into the Roman Empire around the same time, and Domitian was forced to pay Decebalus for a ceasefire in order to attend to the more pressing problems on Rome's northern borders. Several million sesterces, likely paid out in gold and silver coins or bullion, left Rome's coffers and went into the hands of Decebalus and his Dacians. Almost immediately after taking office, Trajan left Rome for the Danube River to prepare a war against Decebalus. Trajan supervised the construction of new forts and fences. He raised new legions as well, bringing the total strength of the Roman army to around 300,000 soldiers. This is the size that it was just before Augustus discharged half his troops. The war that Trajan was preparing made plenty of sense. First, Trajan would want to reestablish Roman dominance of Decebalus and Dacia. Rome had been humiliated in the years before, and the only way to undo the embarrassment was naked aggression. But second, Rome's precious metal supplies may have been running out at this time. The government certainly wouldn't have wanted this information known, but recent analyses of Roman coins from this period show that gold coins were being reduced in weight and silver coins were being made of recycled metal rather than metal extracted from natural sources. In other words, the mines seem to have been running out of silver. And Dacia was rumored to be flush with gold, with several major mines, and if Trajan wanted to rival Augustus as the greatest Roman emperor in history, then he needed that gold and silver. Without it, he was likely to preside over a declining empire. But third, and perhaps most pressing on Trajan's mind, was his own legitimacy. Rome's elites may have been generally supportive of Trajan, but they were nevertheless unsure and a little bit wary of this new emperor as well, despite what we read in Pliny's flattering panegyric. Were the gods really on Trajan's side? Well, Trajan could prove the point with a substantial military victory. Nothing silences the domestic doubters like a foreign war. Randolph Bourne's famous 1918 essay, in which he coined the phrase, "War is the health of the state," was also true in the Roman Empire. But the Dacians were no pushovers. Not only did they have their recent successes against Rome to bolster their morale and make them think they could actually win a conflict against the mighty empire, their fighters were well equipped and trained, because Dacia was not merely rich in gold and silver, but also iron, and Dacian weapons could bite. So in the year AD 100 or perhaps 101, Trajan was finally ready to cast the dice and personally lead his legions into Dacia. His entire regime was riding on this war. Fail and look just as bad, if not worse, than Domitian. But success would legitimize his status and allow him to move on to greater and grander conquests. Well, Trajan's legions crossed the Danube. They marched along and beyond the gorge now called the Iron Gates of Dacia. As they moved into enemy territory, Trajan's troops met very little resistance at first. In fact, it seemed a little too easy. They burned villages as they went deeper and deeper up into the mountains of Dacia. Eventually, they arrived at a massive Dacian fort, and a battle broke out. And although we know almost no detail about what happened, Roman sources suggest it was at best a stalemate. The Dacians only withdrew because a storm hit the area, which they thought meant the gods were unsettled. By the winter of that year, Trajan had yet to earn a decisive victory, and so he garrisoned his army in Dacia. But Decebalus didn't sit around and wait for the next year. The Dacian king worked out an agreement with neighboring tribes to launch a counter-invasion of the Roman Empire. The mighty Danube had frozen over, and so a rare winter surge into Roman territory seemed possible. It would catch the Romans completely by surprise, and Trajan's army would be camped in the mountains of Dacia, far away and unable to help. This situation had the hallmarks of a debacle and even a disaster just waiting to happen. And not just for the Romans, but also for Trajan. But Trajan would figure out how to snatch victory from the jaws of defeat. How did he do it? Find out on the next episode of the Pax Romana podcast.
Thanks for listening to the Pax Romana podcast. For more information, including a list of primary sources and further reading, check the show notes. Music by Red Productions and Exocor. Follow Dr. Colin Elliott on X at ProfCPE or email colin@paxromanapodcast.com. Listen to more episodes on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or just about anywhere podcasts are available. Stay tuned for the next episode of the Pax Romana podcast.